Well, welcome back to the program today, folks. It is just my honor and privilege. I just love this guy here. Dr. David deSilva is our guest today, and he just enriches my life intellectually, spiritually. He has so much experience. He is the professor of New Testament and Greek at Ashland Theological Seminary. He's just a gentle giant of a theologian, got just a beautiful spirit. He's also written more than 30 books, so just buckle up, sit back. I'm going to try to get out of the way and just let David share his profound wisdom and experience with us today to enlighten us about the culture of the New Testament, the geography of the New Testament, and particularly the ministry of Paul. His new book, which we will put in the show notes, is Archaeology and the Ministry of Paul, a visual guide. So those of you who like photographs and don't like to read as much, there's plenty here, and it really does add to the writing and to the text to be able to look at the pictures and let David explain the history involved in it and the geography and some of the things that were going on socially when Paul was there. So David, it's my privilege and honor, brother. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken. Thanks for having me back.
Yes, we did a week in the life of Ephesus, I believe.
It was.
So I want to just hit on a personal note here before we get into the book. Just your personal journey. I know that you mentioned in the book that you were a professor for approximately about 15 years before you ever began to travel and to go visit, places like Italy, Greece, Turkey, Israel. And so I'm just curious as to how this affected your teaching and how it affected you spiritually as far as delivering the word. And do you look back now and say, wow, I was interpreting this? I know you talk about context as being very important. Well, maybe just share some of those thoughts with us about your personal development and your travels, which I think began in 2011.
That's right. So yeah, thanks for that. I was very text focused for the first half of my career so far. And I mean, it was still a rich time. Don't get me wrong. I loved it. And there was so much I could learn about the context of the early church and the kind of challenges they faced just, sitting in my study. And to be honest, I can't remember what motivated me to take that first trip to Turkey back in 2011. I think I think I do remember. I was working on a book on Revelation, one that eventually came out as Unholy Allegiances. And I was struck by the fact that for the first readers of Revelation, the people that John was actually kind of intentionally writing for in those Christian assemblies in those 7 cities, Revelation wasn't just a book of mysteries about a far-off future. Revelation was also lifting off a veil from the world that those Christians inhabited. And John wanted to help them see past the propaganda that they had to swim in every day of their lives in cities like Ephesus and Pergamum. So I devoted some part of a study leave and some resources that Ashland Seminary graciously afforded me for that study leave to spend about a week and a half in just 3 cities, 3 archaeological sites in Turkey: Ephesus, Smyrna, which is modern Izmir, and Pergamum. And I think I spent about 3 days at each site, maybe just 2 at Izmir, because there's a lot less to see. And my goal was to look at the landscape, and I don't mean just like geographical, physical landscape, but the social and architectural landscape, and ask, what were these Christians in Ephesus seeing every day? And what kinds of claims on their lives, their practice, their allegiance did these things make on them every day? And then how would Revelation make them look at these landmarks of their cities differently? How would it orient them differently to what they had to step into the morning after they gathered in that worship assembly and heard Revelation read out loud to them? And honestly, it was a perspective changing, I won't say it was life changing, but it was certainly a perspective changing week and a half for me. And ever since then, I just have not been able to get enough of the archaeological sites that are related to the New Testament and a bit before, Second Temple Jewish sites, for example, just to immerse myself as much as possible in the real world of Jesus and his disciples and the early Christian mission and what have you. So, and that's been the obsession for the last 14 years. I'm trying to get it all done before he hits 65 because, the joint's already starting to hurt. So,
Well, that's great. So, I know a lot of people will never have the opportunity to travel to get to experience some of the things that you have. So we'll try to share some of those, and particularly the book is just awesome. So if people were planning a trip, I know you mentioned some different people and companies who have been helpful to you. If someone was saying, yeah, I would like to go to some of those places, Dr. deSilva, you have any recommendations on that?
I've had really good experiences with 2 tour companies, and honestly, they're the only ones I've worked with. So this is not a judgment on any other tour company, but Educational Opportunities Tours, based in Lakeland, Florida, has been a great partner getting me to some of these sites. And then Tutku Educational Travel, based in Izmir, Turkey, has done an equally fabulous job. I believe I've used Tutku far more for travel in Turkey, although they also organize tours throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Both have been great, and both really have a focus on educational travel.
Yeah, yeah.
They really, and I don't know if I should just call it faith-based, but maybe I should. It's very biblically based, biblically sensitive,
I like
both of
that.
these companies.
Yeah. So you divided this book into 3 different unequal parts. What was your logic, reasoning to kind of structure the book that way?
Well, yeah, the lack of equality of parts is just the nature of the evidence. I guess I could say my main focus as an interpreter of the New Testament is to give the lion's share of the space to those sites that are most directly connected with the books of the New Testament. And fortunately, some of the best excavated, most extensively excavated sites in the Eastern Mediterranean do align with the books of our New Testaments. Corinth and Ephesus and the city of Pisidian Antioch in Galatia, for example, Philippi. And these all have the advantage that they haven't been inhabited since the 6th or 7th centuries. So, I mean, one could do a lot, I'm sure, with the archaeology of Thessalonica if it weren't for the modern metropolis of Thessaloniki sitting on top of the ancient city. So anyway, but the central section of the book then looks at archaeological sites of Paul's church plants, and the bulk of those are also churches that received his letters. And so probably that's the richest point of connection between our New Testament and archaeology. The first part just kind of looks at beginnings. And so we look at Tarsus and Antioch on the Orontes, sometimes called Syrian Antioch. It was in the province of Syria in the 1st century. Now it's actually in Turkey proper, and Damascus. But frankly, archaeological work in those 3 cities has been sparse at best. So there's not a lot from the ancient world that illuminates Paul's early life in Tarsus, for example. And then on the other side of the book, Paul's last journey, as Acts relates it, to Jerusalem, that ends up in the riot in the temple over the accusation that Paul brought a Gentile, Trophimus, into the inner courts of the temple, past that warning sign, which ended up in 2 years of incarceration in Caesarea by the Sea and 2 more years in Rome. So we get to look at what archaeology has uncovered of those contexts. And of course, Rome brings us back marvelously to another, in fact, probably the prince of Paul's letters, the letter that Paul wrote to the Christians in Rome. And thinking in all these instances, how does Paul's gospel resonate with the public story of Rome and her rulers and the myth, the political, religious myth, I'll say, that so many people in the Roman Empire would have bought into before Paul ever arrived to preach a very different good news?
So let's start. We're talking about the ministry of Paul. Let's just begin with Tarsus. We kind of get our first picture of Saul. He is approving of the stoning of Stephen, standing beside there. And so maybe what can you tell us about how this would have formed him as a young man growing up in the city of Tarsus, what was going on in the culture and the society, the history, and so forth, some of the institutions that may have been there. Was this a significant city?
Yeah. So even though we don't have a lot of remains from Roman period Tarsus, we have some good literary records about what Tarsus was like in the first century. And those ancient texts talking about Tarsus say it was a center for education in rhetoric and philosophy. I cannot remember, but some ancient author calls it third to Rome and Athens in terms of education and rhetoric. So probably Paul's early
Strabo, I
year.
think it was.
Say again?
Strabo. Am I
Thank you.
pronouncing it right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, another factor of being on this side of 55. Not everything is there anymore. So probably Paul's early upbringing in Tarsus and any education that he would have had there before moving to Jerusalem would not have positioned him against Stephen per se, but would have positioned him to be a great communicator, which he certainly was. And, from all the reading you've done and other guests you've had, how easy it has been for New Testament scholars to point out the rhetorical finesse of Paul's letters, for example. One other thing, though, that comes back to your question is how Paul remembers his early life. Even though growing up in Tarsus, he calls himself a Hebrew born of Hebrews. So one gets the impression that his family of origin, and no doubt a decent sized community, a Jewish community around his family of origin, were working hard to keep covenant and keep kind of the Jewish identity alive, even in the midst of a fully Hellenized city that I would suggest, Paul also took advantage of, and throughout his life took advantage of what Hellenistic rhetoric and philosophy and literature had to offer him, but also staying true to the covenant. And it might even be that someone like Stephen really sets Paul off because they're both ultimately Hellenists. They're both primarily kind of Greek area formed faithful Jews. And here is Stephen suddenly throwing to the winds some of the major pillars of what it means to be a covenant loyal Jew.
Yeah. And I guess we maybe don't know for sure, but this comes into play later on in Paul's life. Would Paul have acquired his Roman citizenship in Tarsus, or what are your thoughts on that?
So I'm remembering something Paul says late in Acts, I think when he's first being questioned by a garrison commander, when he says he's a Roman citizen, and the garrison commander said, I paid a lot of money for my citizenship. And Paul said, well, I was born a citizen. Well, yeah. So because I want to hear that as kind of a reliable statement at face value, I would say that Paul's parents or Paul's grandparents became Roman citizens. And Paul, of course, inherited that privilege from birth. I have no idea how Paul's parents or grandparents might have been granted citizenship. Two theories that I've heard, both sound good. One of them, Paul's family had performed some important service for the Roman army. If Paul came from a family of leather worker tent makers, big business supplying hundreds of tents for the Roman army in the eastern frontier, could certainly get one a reward. Others have suggested that maybe Paul's probably grandparents were enslaved, may even have been resident in Galilee or Judea, and were enslaved somewhere in the throes of the turmoil happening between Pompey's invasion of Jerusalem in 63 BC and Herod's consolidation of power as king of the Jews in 37 BC. A lot of Jews on the wrong side of those battles ended up deported and sold as slaves. But a lot of slaves in the Roman context would be manumitted, would be freed by their owners, by their masters, toward the end of the master's life as a reward for decades of faithful service. And if you were a slave of a Roman citizen and you were manumitted, you became a Roman citizen. So that's another path to Roman citizenship that a lot of people were, I would say, able to take, but none of them really chose to take. But it seems to me more likely because it doesn't presume meritorious service or being outstanding in some way to the Roman government, just kind of a more natural thing that happens in households and Roman households throughout the Eastern Empire. But we'll never know.
What would be some of the benefits of having a Roman citizenship compared to others?
A huge one is the legal benefit, right? And that's the one we see Paul exploiting strategically. Like I would have exploited my citizenship a day earlier to avoid the beating.
He was a little slow on that one, wasn't he?
Well, but he might. I have a sense that it wasn't Paul's slowness, but Paul's
just kidding,
playing the long game, because he did manage to wring quite the apology from the magistrates the next morning. Be that as it may, having access to better courts and appeals to higher courts is huge. Being exempted from certain summary punishments is huge. And being exempted from miserably painful deaths like crucifixion is huge. So those are all important pros of having Roman citizenship. To be honest, I'm not really aware if there are other more kind of practical benefits, like economic benefits. So I will stop there.
Yeah. So we find Paul, he was consenting for the death of Stephen in Acts chapter 8, the end there. And he's high up, and the high priest had given him the letters. He's on a mission headed toward Damascus. Yeah. And he experiences something there on the road to Damascus. Maybe share with us the significance of this, and maybe dive into a little bit of the archaeology. I know you have some really great pictures there of Straight Street. And, I think that would be of very interest to the viewers as well.
So, the remnants of Roman Damascus are even more sparse than Roman Tarsus. I suppose in part because the regimes in Damascus have not shown any interest in recovering Roman period archaeology. They've had other priorities. So even the gate at Straight Street that I'm able to provide an image of isn't from Paul's time. It's from the 3rd century AD. There you go. But if nothing else, it does put us in touch with a physical location that was of great importance to the trajectory of the early Christian mission. Paul was, it seems, far and away the most energetic, prolific evangelist in the first generation of the Christian movement. And this puts us to the place where he had to come to terms with the fact that his life had somehow been going the absolute wrong direction. And I kind of envy Paul in that so many of us, right, must envy Paul in that the glorified Christ just showed up for him, even if it was to slap him down, but to let him know beyond the shadow of a doubt who Christ was in the plan of God for humanity and what that meant for everything Paul had held dear to that point. I think we find Paul saying the things that he does about the Mosaic covenants, the Jewish law, and he says some incredibly strong things about it, because it was when he considered himself most on fire, most zealous for the Torah, that he found himself most squarely opposed to what God was doing in the present time in Christ. And so we'll come back to him saying things like, through the law, I died to the law so that I might come alive to God. In part, no doubt, a reflection on this very experience. Unfortunately, we have no archaeological anything for that experience, right? It happened outside of Damascus, where even less archaeology happens. And all we have is the shape of the main Roman street going through the old city of Damascus to remind us of what a Roman cardo, a main street, a main thoroughfare, once stood there, and along which Paul was once led, unable to see for several days.
Well, this had to be just psychologically. Paul has been trained in the Torah his whole life. And in a moment of time, his whole thinking about life, as you said, everything I've done to please God has been wrong. And he must have really had to really reorient his thinking and so forth. But It looks like that he began preaching immediately in the synagogues there for a period of time.
So it seems like he did. And I'm pushing a little bit ahead here to Arabia and whatever
Yeah.
Paul did in Arabia.
Yeah. I want
We,
to
we
talk
sim-
about that. Yeah.
yeah, we simply don't know. But if Paul remembers Christ appearing to, or God revealing Christ to him and ordering him to proclaim Christ, the Messiah of Israel, to the Gentiles, to bring them in to the people of God, then it does seem like a very reasonable thing for Paul to do is to go out and start proclaiming Christ. He's remembered to have taught in the synagogues of Damascus until he had to flee Damascus. And he himself remembers.
He had that problem often, didn't he, having to flee?
He did. He did.
Oh,
Yeah. You know, it's quite understandable because his audience in those synagogues was still primarily where Paul was before the glorified Christ appeared to him.
yes.
Paul knew exactly, I think, where they were and what the obstacles were to their hearing this message. And he wasn't surprised when relatively few from the synagogues saw the light, as it were, in the way he did, because it was just on the basis of his preaching and the Holy Spirit showing up, as opposed to a manifestation of the glorified Messiah.
Well, he mentions there that, which I thought interesting, and I've already stopped that, you would think he would go hang out with the apostles in Jerusalem, but I think in Galatians 1:17, he says, no, I did not go up to Jerusalem with the apostles. I went into Arabia for a period of, what was it, like 3 years?
And then returned to Damascus, and then finally went to Jerusalem.
Yeah. So his time in Arabia was 3 years. And we think of, I guess most people might think of Arabia as like a desert and so forth like that. But maybe talk about a little about the geography and the commerce and the trade and what was going on in Arabia at this time, that he just wasn't a monk out in the desert somewhere.
So, yeah, I mean, I think of Arabia and I think of endless sands.
Me too.
But there are pockets in those desert sands of booming civilization already in the lifetime of Paul, actually a century before. So there are two popular possibilities for what Paul was doing in Arabia. One is he went to reflect on his life and figure out what this encounter.
That kind of makes a lot of sense for at least part of it, doesn't it?
It does, except for the part where he's able to start preaching about Christ in the synagogues of Damascus immediately after his experience and his visit with Ananias and his baptism. So, and my own thought is Paul could put together very quickly the significance of a resurrected, crucified Messiah based on everything he knew going into that encounter with Christ. He was just on the wrong side of what he knew going into that. So the second possibility is that Paul went to begin his missionary work in Arabia. And this would largely have been to the cities of what we would call the Nabatean kingdom. You may have, or your viewers may have seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and might remember toward the end as they're going through the Canyon of the Crescent Moon and come out of this beautiful carved facade in rose-colored rock, where the Grail actually isn't, but it was in the movie. Where that was filmed was a part of Petra, which was the Nab capital in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. And I actually had the privilege of visiting Petra about a year ago. I finally made it to Petra in the spring of 24. And it is a vast site. Yes, there are rock-carved mausoleums all around, but in the middle, there are huge temple complexes, a theater, vast forums for commercial activity. It was a hub of trade for Nabs and the caravans that came from east and west to trade there. And Petra wasn't the only such city. There were several other major Nabatean cities east of the Jordan River in the Transjordan, and Paul might have spent time preaching Christ in any one of those, or any number of those cities. The factor that makes that more appealing for me is that Paul also remembers getting in trouble with the Nabatean king's deputy in Damascus. You might remember the deputy of Aretas the fourth is the one who takes an interest in hounding Paul and trying to take hold of Paul, prompting his fleeing from Damascus, as he remembers it in 2 Corinthians 11. That suggests Paul was preaching, but from his point of view, stirring up trouble in his kingdom, and then doing the same thing in the area of a Nabatean colony is the wrong term, but a large navigation in another major trading center, Damascus.
And Paul talks about while he's in Arabia there during this time, he says, I received the gospel by revelation from Jesus Christ rather than human instruction. And again, is he just kind of demonstrating his independence, his apostleship, possibly making the statement apart from the apostles in Jerusalem that he didn't go and like, hey, Apostle David, I need to study with you and you teach me everything. And he's actually saying, I received this from Jesus Christ himself.
Yeah, Paul is under fire in Galatians in an unusual way, right? Rival teachers have come among his converts in the province of Galatia. They've been saying, I don't know why Paul failed to tell you this, but if you really want to be part of the people of God, you've got to join the people of God the way we've always accepted converts, through circumcision and adoption of the Torah-driven way of life. So yeah, Christ is fabulous. Trusting Christ is fabulous. The Jewish Messiah has come so that you have the opportunity now to join the historic people of God. I don't know what's wrong with Paul. Maybe he was just trying to have an easy sell and win you over without telling you the hard stuff. But anyone in Jerusalem, all the real apostles, the ones who we claim, sent us, they'll tell you. And Paul himself, this is likely part of their story. Paul himself was commissioned by them. If he's being faithless to his commission, that's on him, not us. So Paul's really on the defensive when we read Galatians 1 and 2, and he has to affirm two things. First, yeah, he received the gospel through encountering the glorified Christ directly. But second, the apostles in Jerusalem, while they didn't add anything to his message, they acknowledged that God was working through him, that God was doing a great work among the uncircumcised people through Paul and Barnabas, and gave him the right hand of fellowship. So it's kind of this dance of independence and yet at the same time affirmation and unity. So if some other teachers are coming telling you something else, I don't know what's wrong with them. They're not in sync with the agreement that the Jerusalem apostles and I came to on my second visit there.
Yeah, it seemed like they struggle with that off and on, different places that had synagogues and knowledge of the Torah. And so Paul's there for a few years. Then we find him moving on. We are at Antioch on the Orontes. And so this became sort of a kind of a launching pad for his missionary journeys, and maybe just explore that. Why is this place geographically significant, and what was the importance to why Antioch? Why not Tarsus or one other place that they began to launch there?
I think the answer to that is Antioch simply had a large, vibrant, and oriented Christian community quite early. Barnabas, I'm a little fuzzy on the details as I sit here, but it seems to me Barnabas was working in Antioch for a while, and he sought out Paul to come join him there. And the Antioch church commissioned Paul and Barnabas to go out and take the gospel to Cyprus and eventually to what we would call Turkey, to the province of Galatia. And it was, when I say large, I don't mean, huge. I don't think there was any Christian community larger than a few thousand in the first generation of the church. But it was large enough to sponsor missionaries who would go out for several years and preach in other provinces of the empire. Antioch itself was an important city because it was historically was a hub of the Seleucid Empire and remained a very important hub in the Roman province of Syria. It was the capital city of that Roman province. Communication throughout the Roman world was easy from there. All land routes crossed through Antioch on the Orontes. It had a seaport right on the Mediterranean in a sister city. So it was a strategic location. That's probably not why a huge Christian, I said huge, but a sizable Christian community grew there. But it was providential that a mission-oriented Christian community would grow up in that city and would start sending people like Paul and Barnabas out.
Yeah, you've got some great pictures here from Antioch. I'll try to show this to the viewers here. Maybe you can tell us what was happening in
So
yes.
So that is a great picture, but it's
Yeah.
actually from the Decapolis city of Gerasa, modern Jerash in Jordan. And I put that in a chapter on Antioch on the Orontes because there is so little archaeology to be seen. Archaeology of the early Roman Empire in Antioch on the Orontes. Again, we have some fabulous literary descriptions of that city. So one of the things that we learned from those descriptions is that it had beautifully colonnade. I'll start that sentence again. Its main roads were lined with beautiful colonnades and porticos. And at the main intersections of those roads, Tiberius had erected ornate tetrapylons, they're called. They're just these decorative monumental structures which seem to serve no practical purpose whatsoever, just to beautify and glorify a city. Unfortunately, we don't have any of them from Antioch in Syria. So the picture from Gerasa shows what they would have been like. It's another early 2nd century.
Yeah, that chapter is a little bit light on your pictures. And these pictures in the book, folks, unless otherwise noted, these are all photographs that you've taken, David.
So, yeah, the other disclaimer is, while I've gone to some crazy places, I've never been to Damascus, and I never will. And I haven't yet been able to get to Tarsus or Antioch on the Orontes, although I have high hopes of doing so this coming June. Thanks to Tutko Educational Travel, they're having a conference/tour there focused on the ministries of Paul and Peter. So I'll finally get there. But even
on these tours, like you say, you have one coming up in June. Do you conduct these tours? Could people go on these trips with you? How does that work? I know I'm kind of interrupting here.
No, by all means. So I can't say I conduct them because on all these tours, there are professional guides. Because the law in all of these countries is you're going to hire one of our local professional guides for any tour you take. But yeah, it's a day of presentations by a number of scholars. Ben Witherington, Mark Wilson, Mark Fairchild will all be presenting, and I'll present.
That's quite a lineup.
It's a good lineup. And then after the first day, it's visiting what archaeology is there to be seen in Tarsus, in Antakya, the modern city of Antioch on the Orontes, Cyprus, which is really cool. It includes visits to Salamis in the Turkish side of Cyprus and to Pathos in the Greek side of Cyprus. And then it'll finish up in Antalya and Perga on the southern Turkish coast. And Perga is a marvelous archaeological site. And Antalya has one of those beautiful collections of statuary I've seen anywhere outside of the Vatican Museum. So yeah, it'll be a rich experience into some early sites connected to Paul's mission.
We may have to get some information on that from you later on. We're moving on to Pathos, which was the Roman capital of Cyprus. And so I think it was a city that was known for its wealth and cosmopolitan culture and quite famous for the temple of Aphrodite, I believe.
Yeah.
A great center of pagan worship for the Greco-Romans. And so maybe give us just a time reference. When would Paul have, what years do you think that we might say that Paul was in Paphos? And he's got another companion with him on this trip here.
He's with Barnabas.
Barnabas.
And this is early. This is probably 46, 47.
Okay.
No, I take that back. Let's call it 47, 48, because he goes directly from here to the cities of Galatia, which tend to be dated 48, 49. He doesn't spend a lot of time in Cyprus, but Acts does give us this marvelous episode in Paphos, and we're lucky. This is a site that's been well excavated. It doesn't have a modern city on top of it like Antioch on the Orontes does. It has modern.
That makes it a lot easier, doesn't it?
It really does. There aren't complaints when you start digging. In Paphos was recovered a Hellenistic period theater that was expanded in the Roman period. A number of rock-cut mausoleums kind of in the ground that are rather extensive complexes. These are almost like beautiful above-ground villas, but below ground for the dead, even including an atrium open to the sky with a colonnaded porch around it, and then rooms for burial off of that central atrium. And then the centerpiece of the Paphos excavations is a monumental house, which obviously also served administrative purposes for government. So archaeologists look at this. It's called the House of Theseus. It's named that because of a beautiful mosaic of Theseus and the Minotaur in one of the rooms. Archaeologists look at this as a later version of the same provincial governor's headquarters that Paul and Barnabas likely visited when they made their evangelistic trip to Cyprus.
You do have some really interesting photographs here. I'll try to.
Yeah. That's the atrium of one of those tombs that I spoke of.
Yeah.
They're called the tombs of the kings, but they're not burial places for royalty, just for the elite. And that is the main entrance hall to the House of Theseus, which would probably be the governor's administrative complex and residential complex. And there, of course, the remains of a theater that has its roots in the Hellenistic period, so 2nd century BC, but was expanded in the Roman period and kept in use.
And we know from this trip here that there's a Roman official here that plays into the scripture. There's quite a story. Sergius Paulus, who was wanting to hear the word of God, but this Bar Jesus or Elymas was a sorcerer, false prophet of sorts. And he and Paul had a little run-in with wanting to share with Sergius. So maybe tell us what went down on this confrontation.
So yeah, fabulous. It's interesting to find a person who's a Jew in Cyprus who seems to be enthralled with and conversant in the magical arts, right? That's highly syncretistic.
Yeah. Good
Jews don't mess around with magic and sorcery.
That's kind of like Saul going to the witch of Endor.
It is. Or Simon the sorcerer in Samaria that we would have encountered in chapter 8 of Acts. But let's face it, if you can harness spiritual powers, you got your meal ticket in the ancient world, because it's a highly superstitious worldview. And if someone believes you can manipulate spiritual forces to their advantage, you've got a nice guest room in the House of Theseus and a place at a wonderfully laid out table every day. So, of course, when Elymas sees another pair of Jews show up talking about spiritual powers, his only thought can be, great, competition has shown up on my doorstep. What can I do to keep my status and keep my place? But, I mean, hardly needs saying, the power of the one God will outmatch any counterfeit or any lesser power. We might not want to discount the possibility that Elymas really did have some demonic help in his activity, but nothing can withstand the true power. So we almost have a scene here reminiscent of Moses before Pharaoh, putting the Egyptian magicians' tricks to shame, having, his snake staff eat their snake staffs. And Sergius Paulus is impressed. He wants to hear more. And this may be the reason, a number of scholars suggest, that Paul and Barnabas head in the direction that they do when they leave Cyprus. They could have gone in many directions, but they choose to go to Pisidian Antioch in Galatia, where, of all things, we find a sizable inscription with the Sergius Paulus family name on it. So did this proconsul of Cyprus after entertaining Paul and Barnabas, say, I'd really like you to go to my family's hometown.
Go the family. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it was quite the demonstration there. And so I think it shows us too, is kind of in the beginning here, that this thing that Paul's preaching, this Christ, is it's not just for, I mean, this is a significant, Roman officer here, politician, that this is not for just the low class people here, that this all of a sudden, to me, he's like one of the most, in the beginning, significant figures to say, hey, I'm all in. I believe what you're saying. I see it with my own eyes. You blinded a man. You're preaching to me, and, share this with my family. So it's kind of expanding. You see a little bit of an expansion of the gospel here.
That's a good point, Ken. Yeah. To be a consul of any Roman province, you come from the senatorial class, and that is the top 10th of 1% of the population of the Roman Empire.
Well, I didn't know it's that's significant. So
it's pretty rarefied.
Yeah, it would be. And we find here that, and help me on this, David, is Paul begins to change his name here. Is there any significance to this? He's dealing with Romans. He's, Saul. Now he's Paul. And what's up with that?
I'm so glad you noticed it here. So many people just assume he started going by a different name after his encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus. But even according to the story in Acts, he doesn't go by a different name until a decade after that event.
Right.
And it does seem to be not a change of names, but Paul kind of leaving behind his Jewish name, the name by which he would have been known in synagogues growing up in Tarsus and what have you, and simply starts using his Roman name that he also had from birth. As a Roman citizen, he would have had the standard 3 names of any Roman citizen. And we have no idea what the other 2 names are. But for example, the consul that we're talking about, likely Lucius Sergius Paulus. Sergius being I might actually get this reversed, so someone might want to fact check me. Sergius being the larger clan name, Paulus being the family name, Lucius being the particular name of this guy, this member of the Sergius clan. So Paul, the apostle, would also have had the fuller name as a Roman citizen. If he had received his citizenship by virtue of his parents or grandparents being freed slaves, the 2 unknown names would be the family names of the owner that had freed them.
So moving on from there.
Yeah, sorry about that. I went off on that.
No, anytime you go off, it's always a good go off. You can chase rabbits because you always catch them. So we find Perga is the next city moving forward. And I guess most people that have an acquaintance with the scripture would say, well, old John Mark, the deserted us kind of. So, but this was a strategic entry point for Paul to really reach the Gentile world in Asia Minor, wasn't it?
It was. Perga is a major city and it's beautifully excavated. Unfortunately, Perga is a very minor city in the New Testament. We know that Paul passes through there. We know that he will preach there on the way back from his mission. We don't know anything else about what happens with the early Christian movement's intersection with Perga. But it's a marvelously excavated site. Oh, there we go. That's just the remains of the Hellenistic gate. Unfortunately, one of them covered by a scaffolding. It was being renovated. And then toward the bottom there, we have the western gate through which Paul and Barnabas left as they went inland toward Pisidian Antioch. And on the other side there, Ken is showing us the main street of Perga, which unusually in the ancient world has a series of pools all the way down the middle. So there was this beautiful it made the main street a beautiful water park in a way.
Great photos.
So John Mark maybe, begins to get a sense of how far he is from home and exactly how tough the journey is going to be, because they have to pass through some mountainous paths to get from the beautiful, easy, somewhat seaside community of Perga to Pisidian Antioch. It's going to be hard. And he admittedly loses his nerve. Fortunately, that's not the end of John Mark's story. in the New Testament. He does redeem himself. Even Paul says, and bring John Mark with you, for he's useful to me, in one of the pastoral letters. But yeah, it's not a good beginning.
So moving on to Pisidian Antioch, we
Yeah.
have Paul's first recorded major sermon in Acts 13:16 through 41 at the synagogue. And this was located in kind of what the mountainous interior of Asia Minor, was it modern day Turkey?
Yeah, so the elevation increases considerably, but by the time you get to Pisidian Antioch, it's in a broad place again and is a major hub on the Roman road network through what we call Turkey. Pisidian Antioch was the capital, I believe, of the province of Galatia. I could be wrong, but it was a major city in the province of Galatia, set along a Roman road called the Via Sebaste. It was named after Augustus. And what? Acts focuses on Paul's time in the synagogue. And after being rejected by them, going to preaching to Gentile audiences, Greek audiences. Antioch has not shown any real evidence of that Jewish community, archaeologically speaking. That's not to say it wasn't there. It's just to say archaeology hasn't turned up anything yet. A very small percentage of the ancient city has been excavated to date. But I would want to focus on what has been excavated and what it tells us about Paul's gospel and how it's heard in the ancient world. Okay. The centerpiece of the excavations in this Antioch is a vast temple complex erected to Augustus. The temple itself is fairly large, but it's nothing compared to the large courtyard that was built around it, backed with a 2-story semicircular colonnade with other colonnades going forward on the 2 sides. And if you raise the book a little bit, there's a digital image of what it looked like in its heyday. There we go, just another 2 inches up. There you go. Fabulous. Thank you, Ken. And this was the architectural centerpiece of the city, as far as archaeologists can tell. A temple to Augustus and Rome. On the way into this temple, there was an ornate gate on which was inscribed the res gestae divi Augusti, the things accomplished by the divine, Augustus's own obituary for himself, as it were. He wrote it in the last year or so of his life. And it just details all of his benefactions to cities, to the country, his military achievements, the way in which he brought peace to the Mediterranean, which of course was bringing peace through a whole lot of conquest. The colonies of veterans that he planted throughout the Roman Empire, including this very city. Pisidian Antioch was given new life by Augustus as a Roman veteran colony. He settled about 3,000 veterans and their families here. In front of this monumental complex was another large open square that was dedicated to Tiberius, Augustus's successor. All this to say, Paul is now about to preach about a son of God in a city that already has a son of God, Augustus, son of the deified Julius, and Tiberius, son of the deified Augustus. This is the lineage of the gods in Pisidian Antioch, alongside all the traditional deities. There's at least evidence of a temple to Jupiter here, which one would expect in a Roman colony. And a lot of the language that Paul uses, we see it in Galatians, but it's the kind of language we would expect him to have used in his initial preaching about good news. The very word gospel, euangelion, has an imperial heritage. It is a word used to talk about the birth of Augustus, which was good news for the world, or the accession of another emperor as tidings of good news. Augustus is routinely called a soter, a savior, in inscriptions throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. So a lot of the language that Paul will use to talk about a crucified revolutionary in the far-off province of, or sub-province of Judea, was already available and being used to talk about the place of the emperor in the divine plan for the world. All that to say, and not to over politicize things, but when Paul proclaimed the gospel, he was proclaiming a highly countercultural message, and one that would rightly be recognized as subversive. When in other cities he's accused of turning the world upside down, or teaching things that it is not lawful for us Romans to practice. Those are not lies.
You're
That
right.
is the implication of the gospel for the order of the day in these cities.
Yeah, they would have seen that as pretty much revolutionary to hear those words with the political overtones that they would have interpreted to mean. So yeah, that you could see how people could get bent out of shape and start a riot, or let's take these guys outside the city and teach them a lesson. Wow. Yeah. So moving on, David. I don't know how much more we're going to move here, but we have Roman Philippi. And, this might be a good opportunity, I guess, to talk about what Paul was really able to take advantage of was the Roman road system that had been implemented and how it helped his missionary travels for him and his companions. Is it see if I'm pronouncing this right, Dr. David, the Via Ignatia?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Okay.
You could have been a Roman, Ken. Yeah, these roads, of course, were built to facilitate the movement of the army. That was the main purpose.
Yeah.
But civilians used them also regularly for trade, for travel. They simply had to get out of the way if there was a troop movement of any kind and just wait their turn. And there's a gorgeous stretch of the Via Ignatia to be seen between the port city, the modern port of Cavala, which was the ancient port of Neapolis, where Paul and Barnabas's ship landed. There's a beautiful stretch of the road between there and Philippi. I think there's a photo of that.
Yes.
Thank you. So on the top, the port of Cavala, on the bottom, a Roman road that's still, in really good shape. It puts our roads here in Florida to shame, which, just need to be refilled time and time again, several times a decade. Then this road passes right through Philippi. It becomes the major thoroughfare through the city and continues to the west to Thessalonica and to Berea. The entire itinerary that Paul and Barnabas follow in Acts 16 and 17 is along the Via Ignatia. It in part enables their travels, in part kind of determines the course of the flow of the gospel into Macedonia. They only get off the Via Ignatia in Berea because they've got to leave behind somehow the opponents that they made in Thessalonica that are hounding them. They've got to get off the road, find another track so that, they can maybe ditch these people who are trying to undermine their work.
A couple more. These are great photographs
Yeah.
here.
So Philippi, as I think I said earlier, has the advantage of not having been inhabited since about the 6th century. Now, sometimes earthquakes throughout that region are just so severe, the population decides not to rebuild at all. They just move. And that's really good news for archaeologists, because it took me 2 days on the side of Philippi to feel like I did justice to everything that there was to be seen there. It was fabulous. Now, it's not exactly 1st century Philippi that we see. It's mostly 2nd century Roman Philippi. For example, the large forum, which, we associate with where Paul and Barnabas were dragged by the slaveholders of that young girl who had been possessed by a prophetic demon. But that forum is probably in exactly the same place as it was in the 1st century. It was just upgraded in the 2nd century. So we still get a good sense of where it was, how it was surrounded by temples to the traditional gods of a Roman colony, and also to the imperial gods. Augustus, Livia, Claudius all had priesthoods in Philippi. And also, just some of our English translations say that Paul and Barnabas were dragged into the marketplace. Not entirely accurate. The translation of agora could go one of two ways: commercial forum administrative forum. So translators that choose marketplace simply have chosen poorly. They were probably dragged to the administrative forum. That's where the magistrates would be, and would be in a position to hear a complaint and maybe administer summary justice.
Now, marketplace might not be a good place for business to be conducting that, just with Paul.
No. And we do have remnants of a marketplace just south of the administrative forum. So it's likely that the commercial forum was just over there, just a block away, as it were.
So the slave girl, where Paul runs into trouble here, this is another. So they were beaten and imprisoned. And as we were discussing earlier, this Roman citizen, Paul, he and Silas, and this might be a good point too, to maybe, David, I know you're really excellent at this, is to maybe talk about the honor-shame culture that as they're looking at here, and that they lived under. Obviously, for someone to be beaten and imprisoned like this would have been very shameful to them, degrading and so forth. And so maybe just address that a little bit before we get on to the next part.
Sure. And there's one other aspect of honor-shame culture that I want us to hit before we leave Philippi. But just to hit this one, obviously, beating and imprisoning is a way of saying, this is a deviant person.
Yeah.
Do not be like this person. This person does not have value. This person does not have status. And part of the surprise, I suppose, is that Paul and Barnabas show no sense of having been embarrassed by what happened to them.
Yeah.
They are loudly singing in the prison. That's not merely, having a praise time. That's open defiance of the attempt to silence them or to shame them, to make them feel like somehow they have been behaving dishonorably. No, we've been behaving precisely honorably because it's the way that the one God of the universe would have us behave, liberating the captives of the demonic, proclaiming another king, Jesus,
Yes.
and what have you. So they continue to do that in their songs, as it were, well into the night. And then in the morning, as we kind of hinted at earlier, Paul plays the Roman citizenship card.
Yeah.
So suddenly it's the magistrates who are put back on their heels. They have acted dishonorably by treating a Roman citizen in such a disgraceful manner. And the act of their escorting Paul and Barnabas out of the city, even though it does, get Paul and Barnabas out of the city, is a way of saying to everyone who watches that procession, we were wrong, our bad.
They turned the tables on them.
Sorry?
They turned the tables on them.
They did. And it's a way of restoring honor to Paul and Barnabas in the view of onlookers in Philippi. And I think more importantly, it's something that helps the Christians that Paul and Barnabas leave behind to have this be the taste that is left in the population's mouths as Paul and Barnabas move on from Philippi.
That's good. Yeah.
So if I might be so bold.
You can be bold.
Well, thank you. I spend a lot of time thinking about the inscriptions that we see in Philippi.
Yeah, good.
Because there's an interesting cluster of inscriptions around a particular theme, which isn't distinctive to Philippi. It's just that Philippi has a lot of them, and it gives us an opportunity to think about this aspect of Roman culture, which is the culture of seeking honor, of trying to leave a legacy of having lived a life of upward climbing through the rungs of whatever part of society one belonged to. And so there are a number of funerary inscriptions in Philippi that talk about the offices a number of individuals had. Sometimes these are simply military offices. They move from being, I can't remember all the terms, so I'm going to read one. That's probably smarter. Just go to the text. A good example of a military one. Tiberius Claudius Maximus, a veteran, erected this inscription in his lifetime. A knight in the 7th Legion made an office of knights. Singularis, another office of the legion of the legate of the same legion, Vex, that means banner carrier of knights, decorated for valor in the Dacian War by the Emperor Domitian, named Duplicarius in another cohort by the divine Trajan, and so forth. So what we have in this inscription is a series of offices, of honorable offices held, augmenting as they go. He climbed up the military ladder. And in other ones, we find a mixture of military offices and civic offices. One was an aedile and then became a duumvir of Philippi, one of the two chief magistrates in any given year. And this culture of kind of office collecting and rung climbing stands in interesting contrast to two of the passages in Philippians, I think. One in which Paul presents his own string of honors in Philippians 3. Circumcised on the 8th day, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, as to the law blameless, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church. All the things that he could claim that would give him honor in a Jewish context, admittedly, not a Roman context, but a Jewish context. And then he throws it all away. I count all of that as rubbish for the sake of the honor that I can have in Christ. And that honor is gained by a certain downward mobility, by becoming more and more the servant of others, other-centered rather than self-centered in one's climbing. And then the other passage is the famous Christ hymn itself, where we have the one who was equal with God descending rungs on the ladder of honor, becoming a human being among human beings, being found in the form of a slave, among those even descending to the death of a cross. So the opposite of a cursus honorum, a string of honors, we have what one scholar called a cursus pudorum, a string of debasements. But this was precisely the way in which the highest one, Christ, brought deliverance to the world and also gave a pattern for people to follow, very much against the honor-seeking, upward climbing mentality that several of the inscriptions right there in the forum of Philippi bear witness to.
Would these have been sort of like an obituary of some sorts? I know sometimes they did these, they were honored while they were still alive, but like, if you passed away and you had accomplished all these different things, someone might step forward and say, I'm going to honor Dr. deSilva. We're going to erect this here and list these different things.
Yeah. Yes, very much an obituary written in large letters in stone. And so two of the inscriptions that I include in the book were erected for brothers. Oh, you got it right there. Were erected for two brothers by the son of one of those brothers after the brother's death, in accordance with that brother's will. Another was erected by a Philippian citizen on his own behalf while living, but it was clearly meant to be the obituary he wrote for himself before he died. He just made sure the people got it right. And we all know people like that. I'm probably going to write my own obituary just to make sure, people get it right. Don't leave anything out.
Someone who's written 30 books, I expect you can at least write your own obituary. Okay.
And so, yeah, but that's that kind of honor climbing is exactly opposite to the culture Jesus himself sought to nurture among his disciples. Remember that passage in Mark chapter 10, verses 41 to 45, right? Among outsiders. Oh, you know what? I can't remember exactly how he put it. Jesus put it so well. I can't paraphrase it nearly as well. But out there, greatness is measured in being first and ahead of everyone else. But here among you, it's going to be measured by who is most the servant, who puts himself or herself most at the disposal of the other person's good.
Completely flip the script.
Exactly.
Yeah. What they were describing as honor, kind of like the brothers and mom. Hey, I want my boys to sit at the right hand and the left hand, the place
and
of honor.
That's not how this works.
Yeah.
So if I might, because I'm kind of picking up that we're going to probably have to close with Philippi.
I think so. I have
just unfortunate, but on the other hand, anyone who's interested can read the book and get the rest. But I
You
think one
love
of the really cool things about Philippi is that it also includes the remnants of 3 major churches, including one basilica from the 5th or 6th century. I think the 5th century. That's the one on page 76. I don't know if it's showing up on my camera.
Perfect. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Wouldn't see.
So it's not part of the ministry of Paul, but it's certainly the legacy of Paul, that in some of these cities, clearly the seeds that Paul planted in those early congregations took deep root and grew into huge oaks. So there's that 5th century basilica, which is the best preserved. And then there are the footprints of 2 other large churches just north of the Forum, covering the spaces that once housed the temples of Jupiter and Juno and others of the traditional gods. So it's a bit triumphalistic to put it this way, but the archaeological record just shows the triumph of the gospel over the religions that once dominated cities like Philippi. One can see, of course, the same thing in Ephesus. Large churches have been uncovered there. And Cenchrea outside of Corinth. So evidence of the fruitfulness, the effectiveness of the labor of Paul, his team, other evangelists like them are also there to be seen.
It's certainly a testament to the power of God, the truth of the gospel, that these men could go out with pretty much no standing into the Roman Empire at the time and plant churches, make disciples, and that these churches would thrive and grow. It just is, it's a supernatural thing, I believe. They had all the odds against them that this would fizzle out or not go anywhere. But the one thing they had was God, the Holy Spirit, and the truth with them. Yeah. Well, David, I could talk to you. We're going in an hour and a half right now. We can wrap this here. And if you'd like to, we could, I don't know if this would be a 2 or a 3-part series or whatever. We could leave it here, or if you want to come back on again, we could, do some more of these cities. To me, it's very fascinating. And I've traveled this past summer. I went to some of these places and plan on going.
Where did you hit? Where did you go?
Yeah, we went to some of the places in Italy and Malta, Greece, Acropolis, all of that up. I've been to Athens a couple of different times. So yeah. But yeah, it's quite exhaustive, and to try to take this wonderful book, folks. And if you're a Bible student, if you're a Sunday school teacher, if you're a pastor, whatever, or if you just want to teach a class to your high school students or your college students, I thoroughly, highly recommend this. Again, the archaeology and the ministry of Paul and the visual impact it can have. I'm a very visual person. I like to see things, hold them in my hands and examine them, and stand on the ground and look and say, okay, this is what happened here way back when. But Dr. deSilva is he's just a distinguished scholar, and this book is just at the top of my list. David is one of my favorite people to have on. He's so intelligent and he's so well-spoken. Maybe one day I'll get to take a course online with him. Who knows? But David, is there anything you would like to leave before we close this out?
Just to say thanks, Ken, for having me back and giving me a chance to share some of this with the people who view your videocasts. I deeply appreciate it.
Well, it's my privilege to have you, brother. All right. Well, God bless, folks. We'll catch you next time.